Good evening. Welcome to Midnight History. Picture the year 1483. The Wars of the Roses have drenched England in blood for decades. A king is dead. A boy of 12 inherits the crown, and the Tower of London fortress, palace, and prison becomes the stage for one of history's darkest mysteries. Two young princes enter its gates, heirs to the throne of York. They smile to the crowds, wave from narrow windows, and then they are seen no more. What happened in those stone chambers? Were they smothered in their sleep by their uncle, Richard III? Did ambitious nobles strike without orders? Or did the rising Tudor dynasty bury the truth to secure their own power? For over 500 years, the disappearance of Edward V and his brother Richard has haunted kings, scholars, and storytellers alike. It is a tale of innocence and betrayal, of ambition and blood, of ghosts that still walk the battlements of the tower. Tonight, we step back into the shadows of that fortress to trace the fate of the lost princes, an enduring mystery where history and legend are forever entwined. It is night in London. The year is 1483. The Wars of the Roses have painted England in blood for more than 2 decades. On the northern bank of the River Thames, rising like a fortress of stone and shadow, stands the Tower of London. At midnight, the city is hushed. The streets outside are little more than crooked lanes, littered with refuse, patrolled by the occasional night watch with their lanterns and clubs. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and the river's salt. Across the darkened waters, torches flicker along the tower's walls, casting orange light upon gray battlements. Inside the fortress, the halls echo with silence. Soldiers pace the walls, their armor glinting in candlelight. Heavy wooden doors groan on their hinges. Beneath the white tower lie dungeons carved of damp stone, where prisoners once whispered their confessions or waited for the axe. Above, in chambers hung with faded tapestries, England's most infamous mystery is unfolding. For within these walls are 2 boys, 2 princes, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, just 9, sons of Edward IV, rightful heirs to the throne of England, children of the House of York. They sleep, or perhaps lie awake, under the watch of guards who never meet their eyes. They have been brought here, not as honored guests, but as pawns in a game of power. For beyond the tower's gates, whispers grow louder. Who will truly rule England now? The Tower of London was never simply a prison. It was a symbol. William the Conqueror had built its great stone keep to dominate the city, to say with unyielding authority, "The king is here, and he cannot be challenged." By the 15th century, the tower was as much palace as dungeon. Kings celebrated coronations here, queens gave birth in its chambers, but traitors also bled in its courtyards. To walk within its walls was to feel the weight of history pressing down like iron. Some entered as rulers, others left only for the scaffold. For the princes, the tower was meant to be a place of protection until the elder Edward V could be crowned. At least, that was the story told to the people. But Londoners had long memories. They knew the tower was also where inconvenient lives ended. And so, as the city slept, an unease hung in the air. Candle flames guttered as though disturbed by invisible breath. Ravens gathered on the battlements, their caws harsh against the quiet. In taverns across London, men whispered of plots. In the homes of merchants, wives clutched their children tighter. A sense of foreboding thickened the night. Edward, the elder prince, had inherited his father's tall frame and striking features, though softened by youth. At 12, he was old enough to understand the peril he faced, yet too young to resist it. Chroniclers later claimed he was bright, inquisitive, with the same charm that had won his father so many loyal men. Richard, the younger brother, was smaller, more delicate. only 9, his world had always been one of tutors and games, never battlefields or betrayals. He followed his brother's lead, trusting Edward's every word, believing that their family name was shield enough. But in the Tower, bloodlines were less a shield than a target. The boys had been removed from their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who had sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. Torn from her arms, they were escorted under guard through the city's streets, the crowd watching in silence. Some pitied them, others muttered that royal blood rarely slept in peace. Now, behind stone walls, the brothers were alone royal heirs, yet prisoners in all but name. Their childhood laughter had been replaced by hushed voices, by the scrape of boots on flagstones outside their chamber door. For outside the Tower, their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was moving swiftly. Officially, he was Lord Protector, entrusted to guide his nephew to the throne. Unofficially, he was gathering power, questioning the legitimacy of the boy's birth, weaving alliances among lords who had grown weary of the Woodville family's influence. Londoners remembered darker whispers too. The Wars of the Roses had made treachery commonplace. Brothers betrayed brothers, cousins turned on cousins, and the blood of kings stained English soil more than once. Could the new protector truly resist the temptation of the crown? The Tower of London, standing silent and immovable, became the perfect stage. Within its walls, 2 princes waited. Outside, the ambitions of men circled like wolves. And so, as the bells of midnight tolled across the city, the pieces of the greatest mystery in English history were in place. A kingdom weary of war, a dynasty fragile and divided, an uncle cloaked in loyalty, yet suspected of treason, and 2 boys, heirs to a crown, watching candlelight flicker against cold stone walls. No one in London knew it then, but this night was the beginning of their end. The Tower, which had witnessed so many triumphs and tragedies, would soon claim another secret, a secret that, 5 centuries later, still haunts the English throne. The story of the princes in the Tower cannot be understood without first stepping back into the storm that tore England apart long before they were born. The Wars of the Roses, a struggle so bitter, so tangled in blood, that it devoured kings, brothers, and entire generations. Red and white, 2 roses, the white of York, the red of Lancaster. To the people of England, these were more than symbols. They were banners of loyalty, of vengeance, of survival. The Lancastrians, descended from John of Gaunt, had ruled since Henry IV usurped the throne in 1399. For a time, their power seemed unshakable. But Henry VI, who came to the throne as a child, proved a fragile king. He was devout, soft-spoken, easily led and plagued by bouts of mental illness. There were moments when the king simply drifted away, unable to speak, unable to act, leaving a vacuum at the heart of government. In such silence, others rushed to fill the void. His French-born queen, Margaret of Anjou, became his fiercest defender and the driving force of the Lancastrian cause. She was bold, sharp, unafraid of battle, but her strength could not mask her husband's weakness. The Yorkists rose in opposition, led first by Richard, Duke of York, a man who believed he had a better claim to the throne. His family carried the blood of Edward III in strong measure, and his ambition flared each time Henry faltered. Civil war erupted. At St. Albans in 1455, the houses clashed, and England's long nightmare began. Over the next 30 years, the land was torn by battles that spilled blood across its fields. Wakefield, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury. Sons were cut down before their fathers. Noble families were split, brother against brother. Towton, fought in a blizzard in 1461, was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. chroniclers claimed more than 20,000 men were slain, their corpses stiffening in the snow, the rivers running red. From that carnage, a victor emerged. Edward of York, son of the fallen Duke, proclaimed King Edward IV. At just 19 years old, Edward was unlike the frail Henry VI. Tall, broad-shouldered, commanding, he carried himself with the vigor of a warrior. He had marched at the head of his men, fought in the thick of the fray, and inspired loyalty through sheer presence. For a weary realm, he seemed the promise of stability. Edward's reign began with triumph, but England was a land of shifting allegiances. The powerful Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker, had helped place him on the throne. Yet, even Warwick's might could not bind a restless realm. At first, Edward rewarded his allies. He confirmed Warwick's power, stabilized the court, and brought a measure of peace. Londoners, who had suffered years of turmoil, hailed their young king with joy. But beneath the cheers lay unease. For in this world, loyalties rarely held. Edward shocked his allies by marrying not a foreign princess, but Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow of a Lancastrian knight. She was beautiful, ambitious, and fiercely protective of her children. But to the nobles, she was an interloper. Through her, the Woodville family rose rapidly, filling positions at court, amassing wealth, arousing envy and resentment. It was a decision that fractured Edward's alliance with Warwick. The Kingmaker, feeling betrayed, turned against the king he had created. Civil war rekindled. Warwick defected to the Lancastrians, restoring Henry VI briefly to the throne in what became known as the Redemption. But Edward was not finished. Rallying his followers, he returned from exile in 1471, struck decisively at Barnet, and slew Warwick himself. At Tewkesbury, Edward's forces crushed Margaret of Anjou's army. Her son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, the last male heir of Henry VI, was slain on the battlefield. With his enemies destroyed, Edward captured Henry VI once more. Days later, Henry was dead in the Tower of London, most likely murdered under Edward's orders. A crown secured by blood. For the House of York, this seemed the end of the struggle. Edward IV reigned unchallenged, yet the seeds of future tragedy had already been sown. For a time, Edward IV brought peace. His court was lavish, his feasts legendary, his charisma undeniable. London thrived, merchants prospered, and the people tasted stability. But Edward's health would decline too soon, and his sudden death in 1483 would thrust his sons, the princes, into the deadly game of succession. Wars of the Roses had shown England one lesson above all. Thrones are never safe, crowns are never secure, and family blood is often the first to be spilled. And so, by the time Edward IV died, the stage was already set for the dark tale of betrayal and disappearance that would follow. The roses had bled England dry, and their thorns would soon pierce the innocence of two young boys. In history books, the princes in the Tower often appear only as shadows, tragic symbols of innocence betrayed. But before they were ghosts, they were children. To understand their story, we must imagine their world, the courts that raised them, the hopes that rested upon their shoulders, and the fragile dreams that would soon be crushed beneath the weight of politics. Edward, the elder prince, was born in 1470, during one of the stormiest chapters of his father's reign. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey while Edward IV was in exile. There, among monks and candles, she gave birth to a son who was already a king in waiting. From his earliest days, Edward was surrounded by ceremony. He grew up in gilded halls, attended by tutors, pages, and guards. Chroniclers describe him as handsome, tall for his age, with the same fair hair and commanding presence as his father. His intelligence was noted even in childhood, quick with languages, eager to learn Latin, schooled in law, and steeped in the lessons of kingship. But he was not merely a scholar. Edward inherited the martial spirit of his house. At tournaments, he watched knights clash in gleaming armor, absorbing the rituals of chivalry. At court, he learned the subtle arts of politics, when to speak, when to listen, and how to wear the mask of royal dignity, even when still a child. By 12, Edward was already styled Prince of Wales. His title carried immense weight. He was not simply a boy, he was England's future, the living embodiment of Yorkist triumph after decades of war. Beside him stood his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. Born in 1473, Richard was the second son, destined never to wear the crown unless fate intervened. If Edward was the image of a future king, Richard was the reflection of a loyal companion. Smaller in frame, more delicate in appearance, he followed his elder brother with devotion. Chroniclers describe him as cheerful, curious, and affectionate, a boy who looked up to Edward as protector and guide. In the strict hierarchy of the court, Richard's role was clear. He was the insurance policy, the spare heir should anything happen to his brother. Yet he was also cherished. His father created him, Duke of York, at the age of 3, showering him with honors that marked his importance. He was raised not in obscurity, but in privilege. The princes lived in a court glittering with splendor yet shadowed by danger. Banquets overflowed with roasted meats, sugar sculptures, and wine spiced with cinnamon. Musicians filled the air with song, dancers spun beneath candlelight, and foreign envoys bowed to the heirs of York. But beneath the feasts lay fear. Everyone at court remembered the shifting tides of the Wars of the Roses. Edward IV himself had twice been driven from his throne. Cousins had fought against cousins. Loyal men had fallen to betrayal. And so, even in childhood, the princes were taught vigilance. They watched their father dispense justice, their mother maneuver through court intrigue, their uncles command armies. They grew up with stories of Towton and Barnet, of Warwick the Kingmaker, of Henry VI's pitiful reign. To the boys, England may have seemed stable, but to the men around them, it was a peace as thin as parchment. Their education was not confined to England alone. The boys were taught to think as princes of Europe. They learned of France, with its glittering court at Paris, of Burgundy, with its wealth and trade, of Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella. Alliances abroad could shape their fates as surely as battles at home. Ambassadors visiting Edward IV's court often reported back not just on the king, but on his heirs. Were they healthy? Did they show signs of strength? Would a marriage alliance one day bind them to foreign thrones? For the princes, even their play was watched with political eyes. Every word they spoke, every gesture they made, was weighed as evidence of England's future. Yet beneath the crowns and titles, they were still children. Imagine Edward and Richard racing through palace corridors, wooden swords in hand. Picture them chasing hounds in the courtyard, their laughter ringing out over stone walls. In quieter moments, perhaps they sat by the fire, listening to their mother's stories, or kneeling at chapel, their small voices echoing in prayer. They were princes, yes, but also sons, brothers, boys who felt fear and joy like any others. All of this, their education, their honors, their childhood games, was preparation for a future that seemed certain. Edward would be crowned king, with Richard at his side as loyal support. Together, they would secure the Yorkist dynasty, healing the wounds of civil war. But destiny is rarely so simple. The crown Edward IV wore so confidently would not sit easily upon his son's head. For in 1483, The sudden death of their father would hurl both princes into a storm far greater than any lesson had prepared them for. And in the shadows of that storm, the Tower of London waited. To understand the fate of the princes, one must first understand their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Few figures in English history are so shrouded in contradiction, praised as loyal servant, condemned as ruthless usurper, remembered as both reformer and villain. Richard was born in 1452, the youngest son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. From the moment of his birth, England was already in turmoil. His father's claim to the throne placed the family at the heart of the Wars of the Roses. As a boy, Richard lived through chaos. He was only 8 when his father and elder brother Edmund were slain at the Battle of Wakefield. Their heads were displayed on the gates of York, crowned with mocking paper crowns. Such trauma marked the boy deeply. Unlike his tall and striking elder brothers, Richard was slight, with one shoulder higher than the other. Chroniclers, especially those hostile to him, spoke of a twisted spine, though modern scholars debate the extent of his deformity. Whatever the truth, he grew up in a world that valued martial strength above all, and he must have learned early to fight harder, plan sharper, endure longer. The making of a warrior, Richard found his place not in courtly pageantry, but on the battlefield. Under the command of his brother Edward, he fought in the decisive Yorkist victories of Barnet and Tewkesbury. By his early 20s, he had proven himself a capable commander, fearless, disciplined, and loyal to the cause of York. His reward was power. Edward IV appointed him Duke of Gloucester and entrusted him with command in the north of England, a region long troubled by Scottish raids and local rivalries. There, Richard thrived. In Yorkshire, he built a reputation as a just lord and capable leader. He established order, supported trade, and was respected even by those who had once opposed Yorkist rule. For common folk in the north, Richard was not a monster but a guardian, the rare noble who listened to petitions and curbed corruption. The image of loyalty. Throughout Edward IV's reign, Richard was known for his steadfast devotion to his brother. While George, Duke of Clarence, another brother, betrayed Edward, schemed with Warwick, and eventually met death in a barrel of wine, Richard remained loyal. This loyalty earned him trust. At court, Richard did not dazzle with charm like Edward. He was quieter, sterner, more calculating. But he was reliable. He seemed the one brother who would never turn against the king. It was perhaps this very image of dutiful service that made him so dangerous. Few suspected him capable of ambition beyond duty. Few believed he might one day take the crown for himself. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, his eldest son, Edward V, was only 12. By custom, a Lord Protector would guide the boy until he came of age. Richard of Gloucester was the natural choice. And so, the quiet Duke of the North rode south to take custody of his nephew. Along the way, he intercepted the royal procession led by Edward's maternal relatives, the Woodvilles, who were eager to keep the young king under their influence. Richard arrested Earl Rivers, the boy's uncle, and separated Edward V from his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who fled with her younger children into sanctuary. Richard claimed he acted out of duty, preventing the Woodvilles from abusing power. To many, it seemed reasonable. He was, after all, the trusted brother of the late king, but from this moment forward, every step he took edged closer to suspicion. In London, Richard installed Edward V in the Tower of London officially, as tradition dictated, to prepare for his coronation. Yet the whispers began. Why had he arrested loyal nobles? Why had he isolated the boy from his mother? Richard tightened his control. He delayed the coronation. He questioned the legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, hinting that their children might be bastards. The stage was shifting. Richard, once the loyal uncle, now stood at the center of power, cloaked in piety and legality, but moving ever closer to the crown itself. Here lies the paradox. To the north, Richard was remembered as a fair ruler, a man of justice. To his supporters, he was brave, capable, even noble. Yet in London, his actions painted another picture: ruthless, calculating, ambitious. Was this the same man? Or had power revealed what loyalty had long concealed? The truth may be that Richard was both: a loyal brother who became a fearful uncle, a man shaped by loss and war who convinced himself that only his hand could steady England's crown. And so, by the summer of 1483, Richard stood poised between protector and usurper. The people still looked to him with wary respect. The princes, meanwhile, waited in their chambers, trusting that their uncle would guard their future. But history would show that the line between protector and predator can vanish in a single stroke. The tower loomed, the crown glittered just beyond reach, and Richard of Gloucester, the last son of York, was about to decide whether loyalty or ambition would define his name for centuries to come. By the summer of 1483, two boys lived behind stone walls, watched by guards who gave no answers, held by an uncle who now wore the crown. The Tower of London had swallowed princes before, but never had England watched with such dread. This was no ordinary imprisonment. It was the slow vanishing of innocence, a disappearance that would echo for centuries. At first, Londoners could still glimpse them. From the gardens of the Tower, Edward and Richard were seen walking together, pale but alive. They leaned from narrow windows, waving faintly to onlookers across the moat. Children in the city whispered that the princes were still safe, that surely no harm could come to boys of such royal blood. But as weeks passed, the sightings grew fewer. By late summer, the brothers no longer appeared at the windows. Their laughter, once faintly heard from the courtyard, fell silent. Guards spoke less, their eyes cast downward. Even the official proclamations from the crown grew colder, as if the princes had already been forgotten. In a city where rumors spread faster than fire, silence was the loudest sound of all. Whispers soon crept through London's taverns, marketplaces, and alleys. Some said the boys had been smothered in their sleep, pillows pressed down by assassins sent from the new king. Others claimed they had been drowned in wine or buried beneath the tower's flagstones. One chronicler would later record that Sir James Tyrrell, a loyal knight of Richard III, had confessed years afterward to arranging their deaths, though the confession itself was never found, and its truth remains uncertain. Still, the people of England did not need parchment proof. They knew that kingship was bought with blood, and to them, the vanished princes were already dead. The disappearance cast a pall over Richard III's reign. Though crowned and anointed, he could not escape the shadow of the Tower. In sermons, preachers hinted at injustice. In private halls, nobles murmured that the king had murdered his own blood. Mothers warned their children of Richard's cruelty. Foreign envoys reported home that England's throne was stained by suspicion. Even allies grew uneasy. To many, it did not matter whether Richard had given the order. It mattered only that the princes were gone, and he alone profited by their absence. The Tower, once a fortress of authority, had become a tomb of trust. What became of Edward and Richard? Historians still argue. Some believe they were indeed murdered in the summer of 1483, their bodies hidden and their killers sworn to silence. Others suggest they lingered for months, perhaps even years, slowly wasting away in secret. And then there are those who cling to hope that the boys were smuggled out, spirited away in disguise, living long enough to inspire pretenders decades later. But in the eyes of their contemporaries, the truth was simple. The princes were gone. Their beds lay empty, their voices unheard, and in their absence, an entire kingdom felt the weight of betrayal. From that time forward, the Tower of London was no longer just a fortress. It was a haunted house. Visitors swore they heard children's footsteps in empty corridors, whispers behind locked doors, cries in the night. Soldiers on watch told of two pale figures moving hand in hand along the battlements, vanishing when approached. Even in daylight, the tower seemed colder, its stones heavy with unspoken grief. Whether ghostly or imagined, these visions carried the memory of Edward and Richard far beyond their short lives. With their disappearance, the greatest royal mystery of England was born. No trial, no body, no grave, only silence. And silence, history teaches us, is fertile ground for suspicion. The princes became more powerful in absence than they had ever been in life. Their fate would define the reign of Richard III, fuel rebellions against him, and shape the destiny of England itself. For the crown that Richard seized was never free of shadow. Every jewel in his coronet reflected the faces of two boys lost within the tower walls. And so, in the autumn of 1483, the princes disappeared from sight forever. Some in London prayed for them, others cursed the usurper who now sat upon the throne, but all understood that innocence had been sacrificed to ambition. The tower had devoured its prisoners before, but never so completely. Not just their lives, but their very memory, swallowed in stone. From windows to shadows, from whispers to silence, the princes were gone, and in their absence, the kingdom trembled. The princes had vanished into silence, but silence rarely lasts. In its place rose questions, dark, dangerous questions that demanded answers. Who had ordered their deaths? Who had gained by their absence? And could a kingdom ever trust a crown that seemed bought with children's blood? To most in England, suspicion fell at once upon Richard III. He had taken the throne within weeks of their disappearance. He had the means, the boys under guard in the tower. He had the motive, removing the rightful heirs to secure his crown. Chroniclers hostile to Richard would later paint him as a cold-hearted villain, a hunchbacked usurper who smothered his nephews in their sleep. Shakespeare, writing under the Tudors, immortalized this image. Richard as the crook-backed tyrant, sneering, scheming, murdering his way to power. But history is rarely so simple. One alternative suspect was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Once Richard's ally, Buckingham turned against him within months of his coronation. He led a rebellion in the autumn of 1483, rallying those who despised Richard's rule. Could Buckingham have been the one to kill the princes, perhaps without Richard's knowledge? As Constable of the Tower, he had the authority and access. By eliminating the boys, he might weaken Richard's legitimacy, then rise as England's savior. But the rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured and executed, leaving behind only whispers and speculation. Far away, across the channel, another figure watched events unfold. Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian heir. Henry's claim to the throne was weak, while the princes lived. But if Edward and Richard were gone, Henry could present himself as the last hope to end Yorkist tyranny. His mother, the indomitable Margaret Beaufort, pushed his cause tirelessly. She wove secret alliances, arranged marriages, and spread the belief that Henry was England's rightful king. The disappearance of the princes gave her the perfect weapon: propaganda. When Henry landed in England in 1485, his banners bore not just the red dragon of Cadwallader, but also the unspoken promise: with me, you will never see another tower swallow children. For the common people, it mattered little whether Richard, Buckingham, or Henry Tudor had spilled the boys' blood. What mattered was that they were gone, and Richard III sat upon the throne. Every coronation procession, every law he enacted, every act of governance was tainted by suspicion. Mothers still told their children the story of the vanished princes. Merchants whispered that England's crown was cursed. Even those who had once admired Richard in the north now looked upon him with doubt. A king could rule with fear, but not without trust. And trust had been buried with the princes. After Richard's fall at Bosworth, the Tudors shaped the narrative to their advantage. Henry VII had no desire to investigate the prince's fate too closely, whether because he knew the truth or because uncertainty served him better. Instead, Tudor chroniclers sharpened Richard's image into a monster. Sir Thomas More wrote that the boys had been smothered in their beds on Richard's orders, their bodies buried beneath a staircase. Shakespeare later gave the tale immortal form, turning Richard into one of the most infamous villains of the stage. In this retelling, there was no doubt, no ambiguity. Richard was the murderer. The Tudors were the saviors. Yet beneath the polished Tudor propaganda, the mystery remained unsolved. No bodies had been produced, no confession survived. And as generations passed, scholars continued to debate, was Richard truly guilty, or had the truth been twisted to secure a dynasty? What cannot be denied is this: the disappearance of the princes shaped the course of English history. Their vanishing weakened Richard's crown, fueled rebellion, and paved the way for Henry Tudor's victory. But the question of guilt remains open. Was Richard a ruthless uncle who killed his nephews to seize power? Was Buckingham a traitor who struck without his master's leave? Or did the Tudors themselves, once in power, ensure that the princes never reappeared to challenge their fragile rule? We may never know, but in the silence of the tower, every possibility feels alive. And so, the princes disappeared, but their absence was not empty. It was filled with suspicion, rebellion, and propaganda. Their story became a weapon wielded by every claimant to the throne. Richard wore the crown, but never escaped their ghosts. Buckingham rebelled, but fell before his plans bore fruit. Henry Tudor triumphed, but only by using the prince's fate as proof of his legitimacy. The boys themselves left no words, no letters, no testimony, only silence. And into that silence, generations poured their fears, their accusations, their stories. The disappearance of two boys in 1483 did more than stain a crown. It gave England one of its most haunting mysteries, a story that lingers like candle smoke in a darkened room. Richard III reigned for just over 2 years. In that brief time, he worked to strengthen the law, to improve justice, even to win favor among commoners. Yet his crown always seemed too heavy, shadowed by the tower where the princes had vanished. When he marched onto Bosworth Field in 1485, he carried not only sword and banner, but also the invisible burden of suspicion. His cry, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," echoed across the ages, but his kingdom had been weakened long before by the silence of two missing children. Henry Tudor defeated him that day, ending the Plantagenet line. Richard's body lay in a hastily dug grave, his reputation buried beneath Tudor victory and centuries of blame. For centuries, rumors persisted that the prince's remains were hidden somewhere in the Tower of London. In 1674, workers remodeling the White Tower discovered a wooden chest beneath a staircase. Inside were two small skeletons. Were they the princes? No one could say. King Charles II ordered the bones reburied in Westminster Abbey in an urn inscribed with their supposed identity. But science has never confirmed it. Modern calls to examine the remains using DNA testing have been resisted by the monarchy, leaving the mystery unresolved. Even today, the urn rests in silence, like the boys themselves. The Tower of London is thick with stories, and the ghosts of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury are said to wander its stones. Some claim to see two pale figures in white gowns, holding hands, drifting along the battlements before fading into the cold night. Others say that in certain winters, muffled sobs echo from the bloody tower, as if the walls themselves remember. Whether real or imagined, these stories remind us that history is never just written. It is felt, feared, and believed. The Tudors ensured that Richard III's name would forever be tied to infamy. Chroniclers painted him as a monster. Shakespeare turned him into one of theater's greatest villains. In the play, Richard sneers, deceives, and murders his way to the crown, smothering the princes with cruel ease. This portrait has endured for centuries. Even today, mention Richard III, and many picture the hunchbacked tyrant of Shakespeare, not the complex ruler of history. In this way, the prince's disappearance did more than doom Richard. It forged a myth, a cautionary tale of ambition, betrayal, and innocence lost. Historians have never agreed on the truth. Some argue Richard ordered the killings. Others blame Buckingham or even Henry VII, who may have silenced the boys after taking the throne. Each theory holds pieces of evidence, yet none can close the case. The story of the princes remains a riddle, a locked room without a key. And perhaps that is why it endures. For in the absence of certainty, imagination fills the gaps, sometimes with horror, sometimes with pity, always with fascination. The loss of the princes changed more than one dynasty. It hardened England against instability, teaching that a fractured succession could plunge the realm into chaos. It gave Henry Tudor the moral ground to establish a new line, one that would produce Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. It also left us with one of the most enduring questions in history. What is the cost of power? When crowns are won by betrayal, when innocence is swallowed by ambition, what lingers longer, the reign itself or the shadow it casts? Stand today within the Tower of London, and you may feel it. The chill of stone, the flicker of torchlight, the silence of the quiet, unanswered questions. Somewhere between the battlements and the chapel, between history and legend, the two princes remain. Were they smothered? Were they spirited away in secret? Were they victims of Richard's ruthlessness, or pawns erased by Tudor hands? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. But in that uncertainty lies their power. For more than 500 years, their story has haunted kings, poets, and commoners alike. The tower may have swallowed their voices, but their silence still speaks. And so we close the tale of the princes in the tower. Murder, power, and betrayal. A story of ambition and blood, of innocence lost, and of a mystery that refuses to rest. Thank you for keeping vigil with Midnight History. If you listen in the late hours, let the voices of the past drift into your dreams. And remember, history is never only what happened, it is also what refuses to be forgotten. Until next time, may your nights be quiet and your thoughts filled with the shadows of time.